So once again, we're here doing another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. Again, this is a solo one. And my aim with these solo ones, especially to get this ball rolling and to get some information out there and to get some content and some thoughts, is to essentially identify places where I am able to see a missing piece of information that I happen to have, or maybe a missing perspective that I happen to have, that the osteopathic profession writ large may not necessarily have. And I could be very incorrect about these. However, at least from my perspective, so this is a very constructivist kind of viewpoint that, that depends on me and my previous experience and my environment of observation, that there's something missing from the conversation with respect to osteopathy. And a lot of times it's stuff that just kind of pisses me off in varying ways. So instead of letting it sit inside my head and just kind of dance around and continue to bother me, I can at least take a moment and attempt to put this out in a way that can be consumed by many so that they can consider it, they can consider me correct, they can consider me wrong, they can consider me thoughtful, they can consider me a moron. Whatever you want to consider me, that's okay, but at least I kind of get the concept out so that it may be engaged with in some way, shape, or form, be it at the time that I put it out or at some distant point in the future, whatever that may be. So what I want to do is look at some stuff around osteopathic concepts, or the fundamental osteopathic concepts, and the philosophy and the kind of the common 5 models, stuff like that. So I'll pull this up on my screen and just make my face a little bit bigger for the recording. All right, so hopefully it's still, everything that needs to be visible is visible. Okay, so this here, the highlighted portion, is a quote from an osteopathic approach to diagnosis and treatment, and I believe the authors are Stanley Shiwitz, and the last name of the second author is De Giovanni. I do not remember off the top of my head. I don't want to lose my place, so I'm not going to scroll up and down. So just to read the excerpt and then make some comment on it. So the excerpt goes as follows. The American Heritage Dictionary defines a philosophy as an inquiry into the nature of things based on logical reasoning rather than empirical methods. By contrast, a principle is defined as a rule or law concerning the function of a natural phenomenon or mechanical process. Unlike philosophies, these rules or laws can be proved by experimental design or laboratory analysis. With these definitions in mind, it will be clear that the descriptions outlined are properly termed philosophies and not principles, because for the most part, they are based on logical reasoning rather than experimental design. Okay, so what follows is what's common as the commonly claimed the principles of osteopathy. So we have here a description and a definition of the difference between philosophy and principle, or a difference in something that is a thought and something that is a consistent, stable, observable reality. So previously I've talked about epistemologies, or theories of knowledge, or theories of knowledge creation, and I've noted that constructivism holds that the truth or a piece of knowledge is dependent on the individual, the previous experiences of the individual, and the environment of observation. So it's a confluence of things. Now, if you go a layer below that, or go to another concept that informs that, you go to ontology, which is a theory of reality. And you have essentially those who believe in idealism versus those who believe in materialism. So idealism essentially would posit that reality, or what is most real, is ideas and thoughts, whereas a materialist would say that objects are the most real. So we come back up a layer to an epistemology, and we note positivism, and positivism which suggests that what is most real is an object, right? Or you kind of get there. So sorry, to rephrase that, a positive would say that there is a singular reality that can be identified through appropriate experimentation. And this is why, previous to a point like this, I thought it important to talk about the philosophy of science, so that there's some grounding in the concepts that I'm trying to point to here. So we have Stanley Shiwitz and co-authors being willing to note that your common principles of osteopathy, so you can see it on the next page if you're viewing this and not necessarily listening to it, the body as a unit, and you would go farther, and structure and function are reciprocally interrelated on all levels, right? So you see those. Shiwitz and co-authors are admitting that those are philosophical. They are ideas. They are not necessarily things that are observed consistently by varying observers regardless of background. They are concepts. So they are guiding concepts, are not necessarily guiding observable realities. They are common amongst the profession. They are obviously useful to some degree as it stands because osteopathic treatment happens to be relatively stable with its outcomes. You have some good outcomes, you have some bad outcomes, you have some neutral outcomes, but in all fairness, most practitioners, regardless of their viewpoints, have a fairly stable set of positive outcomes for patients, despite the fact, or despite the observable, stable reality that they are guided by ideas and not by stable observable reality. So you could make the argument, at least from this, that people are mostly guided by an idea. So they're overlaying an idea on stable observable reality, which can make it harder to interact with stable observable reality because the idea is the supreme thing, right? So to show some consistency here, I'm going to wait till this thing pops away. It's not going to do what I want. There we go. Okay, now we go over to Foundations of Osteopathic Medicine. I believe this is the 3rd edition. It may be the 4th. I don't remember. But it's essentially looking at the 5 models. Now, this is looking at it in relation to, they would have already talked about the principles, right? Or what Shiowitz and co-authors noted as philosophical concepts or guiding concepts, as opposed to stable, observable, experimental realities. The 5 models, essentially, and you'll have it, just to find the proper quote here, using the 5 models in patient assessment and treatment. These 5 coordinated body functions have been referred to as 5 models, referring to the fact that they represent particular approaches to the patient. The conceptual models are perspectives by which one might view the patient. This is analogous to viewing a patient through a lens. By altering focal length of the lens, one could view different aspects of the patient and gain various perspectives on the patient's struggle to maintain health. This would open many avenues for diagnosis, treatment, and management, including the use of palpatory diagnosis and osteopathic manipulative treatment, OMT. It is important to keep in mind that the 5 models are merely expressions of our physiological functions that maintain health and play key roles in adaptation to stressors, as well as in recovery and repair from illness and disease. Okay, so full paragraph, essentially, again, telling you that this isn't necessarily the stable observable reality. It's a way to think about what you're identifying. So you need some way to observe stable, consistent reality. And one of those happens to be through motion testing, through visual observation, through auditory observation, through palpatory observation, right? So interaction in a relatively full multisensory way with a patient. But again, they're not telling you that this is exactly how things work. They're telling you that that's a way to look and think. And realistically, it's not necessarily a way to look. The way to look is with multiple senses, or the way to observe is with multiple senses. And the way to interpret that is by thinking about the biomechanical model, the respiratory circulatory model, the neurological model, the metabolic energy model, and the behavioral model. So essentially, these things would always be occurring if you believe in the concept and you believe in the idea as a supreme thing. All of these things are co-occurring. It just so happens that at a particular time, the practitioner may benefit from thinking more about one of these things to guide their interaction with the patient. It doesn't mean that it's correct. They don't even suggest that it's correct. They just say, hey, these are some ways you can think about stuff. Right. So again, we see some consistency that the things that dominate the profession as far as discussion and as far as, quote unquote principles, in at least the Stanley Shiowitz and co-authors, Di Giovanni's approach to this, or view of this, those are philosophical, those are ideas, those aren't necessarily things that can be proven by experiment. So we've got this really weird breakdown where you're seeing things that dominate in the discussion of the profession as ideas, right? So it's the preference for that constructivist viewpoint, the preference for that idea as supreme, as opposed to stable, material, observable reality as supreme, right? So it's at least consistent. It's intoned. It's not directly stated in, or explicitly stated in as many words, but you can see that there's some consistency, that there's a preference for ideas. Right now we get into osteopathic diagnosis. I believe, I do not remember the specific name of the author, and I can scroll up after. I just want to look at this before I do that. It's an osteopathic practitioner from England. I'll say the UK, not necessarily England, because I don't know where the gentleman was specifically born. Anyways, we go into a quote here: current concepts of osteopathy. Osteopathy is a system of clinical practice that looks at the person from a mechanical point of view and emphasizes the importance of the musculoskeletal system to overall function and health of a person. Still's original ideas have been developed at the Kirksville College of Osteopathic Medicine in the 8 philosophies shown in Figure 1.1 and described in detail below. These are described as philosophies since they are derived by logical reasoning rather than by empirical findings through scientific experiment. Okay, so you see it again. These are ideas. These are philosophies. These are not things that were generated from experiment and through stable, consistent observation, regardless of who's looking. These are ideas as supreme. These are not stable, consistent, shared reality as supreme. Okay, you've got to, there's great value in paying attention to that. There's great value in being reminded of that. So you get the body as a unit, structure and function are reciprocally interrelated. Body possesses self-regulatory mechanisms. Body has the inherent capacity to defend itself and repair itself. When normal adaptability is disrupted or when environmental changes overcome the body's capacity for self-maintenance, disease may ensue. 6, movement of body fluids is essential to the maintenance of health. 7, the nerves play a crucial part in controlling the fluids of the body. 8, there are somatic components of the disease that are not only manifestations of disease, but also are factors that contribute to maintenance of the disease state. And then finally, implicit in these philosophies is a belief that osteopathic intervention can have a positive influence on the above. Okay, so you've got this set of ideas that are held to be relatively important or important above other things. And then if you go back up, right, you see the specific explicit note that the osteopathy is a system of clinical practice that looks at a person from a mechanical point of view and emphasizes the importance of the musculoskeletal system to the overall function and health of a person. Okay, so the osteopathic intervention, you could essentially say, is based on that musculoskeletal approach, right? So that essentially, I would argue, a movement-based approach. When there is a movement problem, right, there will be some relationship to health and disease states. So something that I've stated in varying places before is that osteopathy as a profession centrally holds that there is a mechanical relationship to health and disease states. So the mechanical relationship is some alteration in movement capacity that's identifiable to a practitioner. Now, the reason I have to stress identifiable is that you are working from the outside of the patient. You do not have the aid of images in the moment. You have to rely on your multisensory experience of a patient, being vision, audition, and palpation, sometimes scent, not always. There's some times when maybe scent is important, but realistically it's vision, hearing, and touch. In that multisensory way, you have to assess movement characteristics. So it's either going to be joint movement, so you would look at movement of a limb, or the yield of soft tissues to pressure. So they either move in an expected way or they do not. They either move equally compared to their paired structure or they do not, right? So whether it's soft tissue or joint motion or gross motion, you're working from the outside. So it has to be identifiable to the practitioner. Osteopathy admits in its standard textbooks that it is based primarily on ideas that will guide the interaction with stable observable reality. It also, while less explicitly, admits that it's looking at essentially movement-based assessments. So there's a paper that I like to cite. It's Yuri Dinar et al., D-I-N-N-A-R, and it classifies osteopathic assessment methods. And essentially, all osteopathic assessment methods can be argued to be movement. Like, that's it. It either moves, the joint either moves, or the gross motion either happens, the small motion happens or it doesn't, or the soft tissue yields to pressure or it doesn't, right? So they'll talk about superficial and deep palpation of soft tissues. So that would be yielding to pressure. So osteopathy is often discussed with the idea as supreme by the practitioners that I've interfaced with, while not necessarily noting that the standardized textbooks admit that these are ideas and philosophies. They're not necessarily experiment-based. You'll also, or I have heard a common refrain that science can't prove osteopathy. And what I would counter with is that it can. It's just that we don't like the answers because we start with a conclusion instead of starting with a question. or osteopathy writ large has started with a conclusion rather than a perception. And one of the reasons you can argue that more firmly is that you see evidence everywhere you look that osteopathy prefers ideas as supreme, as the biggest thing. Osteopathy prefers to be guided by, ontologically or in the study of reality, the individual and the idea versus the material and the consistent and the stable and the shared, right? So it prefers to be a little bit individualistic and idea-based, where it doesn't seem to like to be consistent between individuals. And in that case, what you're doing is you're saying reality is dependent on the individual. You're more of a constructivist. You're more likely at that point, especially when you have a set of predetermined ideas that you have ascribed to, look at the concept and say that the concept is already there. It's the most real thing. So you start with a conclusion. The conclusion is your concept. So you're probably less receptive to appropriate methodologies to investigate what is shared, what is stable, and what is consistent in that positivist style way, or in that materialist type way. Now, I'm not saying one is more correct than the other. I will freely admit that with that constructivist preference, osteopathic practitioners seem to perform positive work for patients. I think there's a possibility that if we are willing to consider a more positivist type of view, or a more stable, consistent, observable, shared reality approach based on objective measures of some form, and we can argue about what those would be, but we can do that. And when we do that, we can start to understand where osteopathy would be extremely effective and where it would be less effective and where it wouldn't be effective, as opposed to saying it's going to work for everything because these ideas are always there, they are always true. So I think I've given some evidence to support the claim that osteopathy prefers the ideas. It prefers, at least in the standardized textbook, to have a guiding set of concepts that are just ideas. They're ways to look at things. So they box thought in a particular way. You'll commonly hear this concept of thinking outside the box, right? Think outside the box, think outside the box. Now, from a very superficial philosophical point of view, if everybody ascribes to thinking outside the box is the box, right? So then if you just think based on details that are available and you take a cognitivist approach and you get more details, then you'll be able to think in a different way. But if all you're ever trying to do is think differently, you don't have details, and all you're doing is thinking. You're not necessarily paying attention to things that could guide you in different directions. So if you ascribe to these ideas, the body is a unit, right? That's obvious, kind of a big no duh. If it wasn't a unit, how would it function, right? Structure and function are reciprocally interrelated on all levels. Well, how would you ever separate the two? They co-occur, right? So no duh, right? The body has the inherent ability to repair itself. No duh, it's obvious. Now, there are times when it doesn't do a good job. No duh, we've all seen this. The fourth one that's most common is intelligent or rational treatment is based on the above, right? I call that the cop-out. It's kind of no duh, right? So if that's the way that you view reality, you view it as the idea as most important, and you overlay the idea onto everything, then it's really easy to miss the consistent, stable, shared reality, right? The objective reality, the view from nowhere reality. It's easy to miss that and easy to not like it, or easy to avoid, because my ideas are always there. My ideas I experience all the time. So no matter what I do, no matter what success I have, it's in relation to the ideas, because that's the perspective. So what I would say is that the constructivist view, or that view of the individual reality, is always co-occurring with the positivist reality, right? So there are things you can't negotiate. There are things you can't avoid. There are different ways to interpret that, and that interpretation is definitely a constructivist thing. It's definitely based on the individual. So how you experience a sensation. So we're aware, because of a positivist approach, that people will experience the same stimulus in varying ways. They'll describe it in varying ways. They'll show different neural activation in response to the same stimulus. They'll sweat differently in response to the same stimulus. So you can see there's variations in interpretation. based on consistent measures, right? So you can see that. So they both co-occur. I think osteopathy spent a lot of time in the constructivist realm. It may be very useful to the profession and the patients if we spent a little bit more time or attempted to get better at the positivist realm. So I'll leave it there by repeating that osteopathy definitely seems to be more of an idea first constructivist approach. And I think we're all going to benefit from considering more of a shared reality, material, objective approach. So hopefully some of that was useful for you. Talk to you soon.